Word darshana means drush, comes from the word root word or a dhatu drush pashyati, to see the world through a certain viewpoint. So philosophers in ancient India observed nature and recorded their findings. And when these groups of philosophers belong to different schools of thought, and Nyāya is one of those. Nyāya is logical reasoning. It is actually beyond, more than logical reasoning. We talk about lineage, how from Akshapada Gautama, then we see sage Vatsayana or philosopher Vatsayana, not to be confused with the author of Kama Sutra. He is a different Vatsayana. He is believed to have lived somewhere around 5th century AD or CE, and he wrote commentaries or bhashya on Nyāya Sūtras. Then after him, these are the main, very prominent philosophers that we see. There are numerous other dozens of other philosophers. Then we see Vatsayana, then Vachaspati Mishra, very popular. He wrote a Tika. Tika is on the commentary, he wrote notes, or he explained the commentary further. On Vatsayana, then we see Udyotakara, we see Udayana. Then comes two prominent Gangesha. Gangesha is a 12th century philosopher, and then Sriharsha. This framework of arriving the truth was applied in many sciences and humanities. Ayurveda, Jyotishya, Ardhashastra, Ganita Shastra, and so on. Vadashastra also appears in Mahabharata, Kautilya's Ardhashastra. And you can actually see, in even Vedanta too, you can see Nyāya.
Namaste, ladies and gentlemen. I am Ujasvi Mishra, and I welcome you to another episode of Indic Talks organized by the Center for Indic Studies. Today, we will be discussing Nyāya Darśana, the beauty of reason in Indian thought. We are joined by Dr. Rajeev Kurapati ji, who presents a concise overview of Nyāya Darśana, the Indian school of logic and epistemology. Focusing on its core principles and approach to knowledge, the talk explores how Nyāya shaped rigorous reasoning in classical Indian thought and why it continues to be relevant today. Dr. Kurapati ji is a US-based physician and philosopher who obtained medical training in Chennai, Kentucky, and Arizona. He holds an MBA and a master's in Sanskrit and authored award-winning books blending medicine, philosophy, and spirituality. I welcome you, sir, and I request you to take over from here.
Thank you, Ojasvi ji. Thank you for having me on your platform here. I'm happy to be back on this, interacting with your audience. We can get started with the PowerPoint here. So my topic today is Nyāya Darśana. Nyāya word comes from Ni dhatu, which is the root word. As you know, in Sanskrit, there are root words called dhatus from which you build language, from which you build words, and from there sentences and everything. Ni nayati means that which takes us forward. That is where the word Nyāya Darśana. Why is this important? Why am I, as a physician based in US, in the age of science and technology, where people are talking about artificial intelligence, people are talking about robotics, going to space, talking about electric vehicles, and so on and so forth, semiconductors, and all these things? What is the role of this ancient philosophical thought? When we, you can advance to next slide. When we think of, imagine this, all sciences, people who go through rigorous training, formal training in sciences and research, their apex degree is PhD, right? So apex degree is PhD. PhD stands for doctorate in philosophy. So why are scientists getting a doctorate in philosophy and not, so to say, doctorate in science? Although there is a doctorate in science, but the most common one, the most widely accepted throughout the world, even in Eastern civilizations like China and India, you still have PhDs, right? So because philosophy is the bedrock of all sciences. Unless you have a philosophical understanding of what is the goal of your scientific achievements or endeavors, you need to have a certain goal in mind, a human goal. What is the purpose? And that philosophy gives us. So that is why philosophy becomes important. But when it comes to Indian philosophy, we tend to confuse between faith and reason. What we talk in Indian terms, the most common philosophies currently in India, or coming from India, spread to the world, throughout the world, is Vedanta and yoga, right? So yoga and Vedanta are the core Indian philosophies, where both originated from India, and no other civilization or country claims it that as their own. It is purely from India. So Vedanta and yoga, those are the quote unquote philosophies. But all other philosophies, we don't usually hear about them. We tend to think of faith, which is religion, and festivals and beliefs, as the core Indian philosophies. But there is actually a branch of Indian philosophy called Nyāya, which form the bedrock of all Indian sciences, including Ardhashastra, Ayurveda, Ganita Shastra, and so on and so forth. We'll come to that in a minute. But when we talk about philosophy in general, throughout the world, especially in India, where we should be knowing our own philosophers, we all know about Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, René Descartes, Locke, Hume, Immanuel Kant, and so on and so forth. But most of us, except maybe your audience, the people who are listening to this talk, some of your audience might be familiar with these names. But most of us growing up in India have never heard about Gautama, Kanada, Kapila, Panini, Jaimini, and so on. These are our philosophers who created our sciences, right? If you advance to the next slide. So before we go into the knowledge creation of, our civilization, just like Chinese and other great civilizations, is not based on, especially Indian civilization or Bharatiya civilization, is not based on conquering like Mongols, right? Like Mongolian civilization. Our civilization is based on knowledge creation, and through that we have advanced our understanding of our role in this world, of the world, and our role in this world. So imagine or think of a temple called Kailasha temple. Now, I'm not talking about faith or religion here. I'm talking about when we talk about Kailasha temple in Ellora, okay? Ellora, Ajanta Ellora caves, we know them, right? So there is a particular temple called Kailasha temple. It is the world's largest monolithic structure. It is built using what is called vertical excavation. And during this was built, by the way, roughly 13 to 1400 years ago, in 1756 to 1773 CE. So they removed from a huge stone, almost like a mountain or a hill, they removed 200,000 tons of rock, which is 2 lakh tons of rock, to build this temple. The temple is 300 feet long and 175 feet wide. It is huge, in other words. And they built it from top to bottom. Usually we build from bottom up, right? But they built it from top to bottom. You can see the pictures that are a lot of vlogs, a lot of travelers visit there. You can see that. And even to this day, the engineers who visited from the West, from America, from Europe, Australia, what they have noticed is there is no way we can build a similar structure even now with the current technology, even with the advanced computer-aided designing and so on and so forth. There is no way we can build it. But Indians have built it 13 to 1400 years ago, when the Western world was going through intellectual hibernation during the medieval period. Indians are building these humongous structures that were never heard of, never built anywhere, and never could be built. Na bhuto na bhavishyat, right? In the past or in the future, you cannot build such a structure. And there is no way they could have done it without the knowledge of engineering. Forget about religion, forget about gods and theology and so on for a moment. Just think of the engineering marvel that they were able to build. And you can see beautiful such structures everywhere throughout the India, extending into Nepal, Burma, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and so on and so forth. So that is one side of the sciences, the engineering science that I'm talking about. So in other words, what I'm trying to bring to your notice is knowledge creation. Knowledge creation, there is a structure to it, right? So you create knowledge using observation of your surrounding environment, of the surrounding nature, and you create hypotheses. Hypotheses are nothing but intelligent guesses. So when I say brushing your teeth twice a day is good for your teeth and gums, that is an intelligent statement. That is a guess. Now I have to prove it. Now I have to prove it using whatever means is necessary. Now we use it, what we call controlled experiments, to prove it. In the past, our scientists used a similar type of methodology, and Nyāya formed the bedrock of such a methodology. So knowledge creation, once you create knowledge, you have to validate it, correct? You have to test it whether it's true or false. And then you have to apply it to practical life. And then you have to either after or before. Sometimes you do verification after application, sometimes before application. You verify it, you improvise it, and then from this process, new knowledge may be created, and that new knowledge goes through this knowledge creation cycle again. So if you can advance to the next slide. So here, Nyāya comes into the picture. In this knowledge creation, Nyāya does two things. One is knowledge creation. Second is, one is observation of the world around us. Second is validation of that knowledge. We'll come to that in the next few slides. First, I want to introduce these 6 schools or darshanas, schools of philosophies. Philosophy, the word darshana means, drush comes from the word, root word or a dhatu, drush pashyati, to see what? To see the world through a certain viewpoint. So philosophers in ancient India observed nature and recorded their findings. And when these groups of philosophers belong to different schools of thought, and Nyāya is one of those. Nyāya is logical reasoning. It is actually beyond, more than logical reasoning. We'll come to that. And then we have Vaisheshika, which is metaphysics and atomism, which is Anu or Paramanu. Vaisheshika school of philosophy, or Vaisheshika Darshana, talks about the world is made up of tiny, tiny particles, and by combining these particles, you get bigger matter. So it is about matter and the interaction of matter with other matter. So that is the Vaisheshika. Then we have Sankhya. Sankhya is talking about, these are the reductionists of Indian philosophy. Reductionists of Indian philosophy in the sense that how did things evolve in nature? Where did it start? How did it end up with complex things? That is what Sankhya talks about. Purusha and Prakriti. These are all, when you talk about Purusha, Prakriti, it appears we are talking some kind of Hindu religion. It is not. Purusha, Prakriti means the Purusha is the intelligent principle, just like the electricity behind the bulb. Prakriti is the matter, Purusha is the intelligent principle behind it. Without the intelligent principle, in other words, without electricity, you're not going to have a bulb that lights, right? That glows. So Purusha and Prakriti is important. And yoga, you have the mind sciences, mind and physical body, mind sciences. For example, you have what is called Bahya Karana, outer in a human body, Bahya Karana, the organs of external organs, literally external organs, Bahya Karana. And you also have Antah Karana. Antah Karana is inner organ. Inner organ is further divided into Manasa, Buddhi, Ahankara, and Chittam. So you can see this beautiful division of inner organ, the one that makes the Bahya Karana function, activate. Inner organs, Manasu, Buddhi, Ahankara, and Chittam. So Chittam, for instance, is subconscious. So you have all the stored impressions within the Chittam, and then Manas is the one that says yes or no, should I do it, should I not do it. Mano Buddhi says yes, go ahead and do it. Go ahead and should I take up this job or not, Manas. And the Buddhi comes in and says, yeah, go ahead and take it or don't take it. Whatever the decision is done by Buddhi. Mano Buddhi Ahankara. Ahankara, Ahankaromi. I'm that agency within us. Ahankara and Chittam. All this is stored within the subconscious, that is the Chittam. So Yoga and Sankhya talks about all these things. And then we come to the Vedic ritualism, which is Purva Mimamsa. Purva Mimamsakas are also philosophers, in the sense that they analyze the Vedic Vedic literature and suggested this is what they actually mean. So Vedas, as we know, is the bedrock of Bharatiya sciences and philosophy. So that is where it actually started from. And Purva Mimamsakas are philosophers. Mimamsa means vicharana. Mimamsa, the word Mimamsa means vicharana. So they are the ones who analyzed it, and then ultimately we know the most common philosophy of Indian origin these days is Vedanta. It is the philosophy of Upanishads. Ojaswiji, if you can advance to the next slide, please. So, yeah, next slide. We see that we are coming to the Nyāya. Now we talked about the different Shad Darsanas. Shad Darsanas, where did that word come from, or where did that Shad Darsana come from? It is from a book called Sarvadarshana Sangrahaha. And in that book, the author lists all these. In fact, Madhusudan Saraswati, who is a Vedantin, so he lists all the Shad Darsanas so that you study them and use them to study Vedanta. Okay, so he actually he lists all this, he describes everything so that he can use all this to make a point about Vedantic viewpoint. So that is how we got these Shad Darsanas. But when you zoom in on Nyāya, like I said in the beginning, it helps in two ways. One is it helps in knowledge creation, it helps in validation. So you see that knowledge, this is not an extensive talk on Nyāya, it is only introduction for lay people who wants to, or who is interested in understanding what is the foundational philosophy of Nyāya, how is it valid, how is it important for us for this day and age. So this is for those type of people. So for those who are interested in getting to know more about Nyāya, there are detailed books on Nyāya. And in my MA Sanskrit, in my course in MA Sanskrit, I was taught these principles, and I'm presenting these to you. And in my upcoming book on Indian philosophies rediscovered, published by Rupa, I have given a large chapter on Nyāya Vaishya, on all the Shad Darsanas. So from that, let us go on to see what Nyāya is talking about. Nyāya begins its analysis by classifying this observable universe into fundamental categories. Now, think of reductionism, right? So, fundamental categories. They talk about Dravya, Guna, Karma, Samanya, Vishesha, Samavaya, Abhava. These are the 7 categories that Nyāya divides, and then it goes into great detail into each of these Dravya, Guna. Dravya means, for example, there is a cloth. The material, the fabric that you use to build the cloth is the Dravya, or stone. You have the hardness is a character, which is the quality, which is the second point. The Guna, the hardness of the stone, is embedded or is part of the matter of the stone, which is the Dravya, right? So similarly, human mind also, they don't, Nyayikas, the philosophers of Nyāya are called Nyayikas. They don't just stop with physical matter. They talk about they talk about abstract concepts also. In fact, from matter to Atman, this whole Nyaya can be used to analyze or to debate, to validate, to create new knowledge from matter to the most abstract concepts. Okay, so Dravya, Guna, motion or activity or karma, what are the characteristics? Samanya, distinctive common characteristics of a particular substance, distinctive characteristics, Vishesha, and Samavaya, Abhava, absence of. These are all important concepts for those who want to study more of Nyaya. Yeah, role of Nyaya. So we see that Nyaya principles are applied across all spectrum of different philosophies in ancient India, from Sankhya to Vedanta to Mimamsa to Jain and Buddhist philosophers. Next slide. So next we'll see how Nyaya evolved before we go into what Nyaya is about. Roughly about 6th century BC, again, this date is contested again. Some say it is earlier than that. Some say it is more recent than that date. But 6th century BC has been accepted by even Western scholars. In some books like Karl Potter, the Akshapada Gautama was credited to have created what is called Nyāya Sūtras. Just like Patanjali put together Yoga Sutras, it doesn't mean that Patanjali is the father of yoga. Yoga was there even before Patanjali, centuries before Patanjali, but he collected them all together, put them in the form of sutras. Sutras are aphorisms, short statements. There is even a definition for what a sutra is. Alpaksharam asandigdham saravat vishwatomukam astobham anavadhyantya sutram sutra vido viduhu. I'm not going to get into all of that, those details, but here for our purposes, Nyāya Sūtras were put together by a person or a philosopher or a scholar named Akshapada Gautama around 6th century BC. In fact, that is the date where a majority of the philosophers are credited to be. It is very interesting that Confucius, Gautama Buddha, Socrates, Plato, all these people belong to that period. We don't know if it is because of the Westerners didn't want to give credit to the Eastern philosophers belonging to even prior to Socrates, prior to Aristotle. We do not know. That is not the topic of today's conversation, but let us say Akshapada Gautama, belonging to 6th century BC, he was the one who put together Nyāya Sūtras. Nyāya Sūtras is an interesting thing. So it consists of 528 sutras. It covers reason, logic, epistemology. It covers metaphysics. It covers dialectics. It gives us an idea of how to do a proper debate to arrive at truth. It does not, interestingly, it does not delve into Vedic ritualism. It does not go, but obviously it doesn't go because that is not the focus of study or specialization of Nyaya. Mimamsakas or the philosophers who dealt with Vedic literature, Vedic ritualism, and so on. So Nyaya is not interested in that. So next slide, please. In the Nyāya Sūtras, you see 5 chapters. Nyāya Sūtras were later, over the next several centuries, where they were debated, they were improvised, and newer books were numerous. Hundreds of books were written on Nyaya philosophy. It is not like the Nyāya Sutra was the final word on Nyaya. It was challenged, it was improvised, it was contested, and so on. So Nyāya Sutra, when we look at it, there are 5 chapters. I wanted to present what is in the Nyāya Sutras. But they talk about nature of arguments, methods to establish proof, and the potential pitfalls in reasoning. In the next second chapter, they talk about the Nyāya Sutras, talk about the theory of doubt, how knowledge should be understood through inference, through logic. In the next chapter 3, they talk about Atman. Atman should not always be construed as something Vedantic. Every philosophy in every Darshana in Indic knowledge talked about Atman, because that is the core of us, correct? The concept of Atman, defining its essence of a person and the source of judgment coming from it. And then chapter 4 talks about theory of causation, the theory of cause and effect. These are all very, very fundamental philosophical concepts, philosophies or darshanas that you have to touch upon when you want to address any field of science. Even today, we have to talk about all these things. And then ultimately, Nyāya Sūtras talk about practical guidance for debates. They list 22 pitfalls that can lead to losing an argument, losing a debate. So these are the, in general, very bird's eye view of Nyāya Sūtras. The next slide, please. Then we talk about lineage, how from Akshapada Gautama, then we see sage Vatsayana, or philosopher Vatsayana, not to be confused with the author of Kama Sutra. He is a different Vatsayana. He is believed to have lived somewhere in around 5th century AD or CE, and he wrote commentaries or bhashya on Nyāya Sūtras. Then after him, these are the main, very prominent philosophers that we see. There are numerous other dozens of other philosophers. Then we see Vatsayana, then Vachaspati Mishra, very popular. He wrote a Tika. Tika is on the commentary, he wrote notes, or he explained commentary further. On Vatsayana, then we see Udyotakara, we see Udayana. Then comes two prominent, Gangesha. Gangesha is a 12th century philosopher, and then Sriharsha, another 12th century philosopher. Nyāya Vaisheshika, Ganesha was the one who put together two philosophies. One is Nyāya, second is the Vaisheshika, put together, or he kind of created a hybrid model, which came to be known as Navya Nyāya, in contrast to Prachina Nyāya. The older version is Prachina Nyāya, improvised a hybrid version of Nyāya Vaisheshika, also called Tarka. It was put together around Gangesha time in the 12th century. And then we see Sriharsha. Sriharsha wrote a text called Khandana Khandakadya, deconstructing the basis of Nyāya's epistemology on logic and criticize some of its precepts. So you see this kind of arguments going on between, or improvisations going on from time to time, all the way to the 12th or 13th century. And from there, you see the intellectual hibernation happening even up to now. The last almost 800 to 900 years, you don't see a lot of Nyāya being furthered. Although the Vedanta philosophers study Nyāya, but it has it is not common in schools or philosophy institutions to study to advance Nyāya anymore. So next slide is kind of a diagrammatic view of the same lineage: Vatsayana, Udyotakara, Vachaspati Mishra, Udayana, Gangesha, and Sriharsha. Then in the next slide, we get into a little bit, just a kind of a touch of Nyāya philosophy. Please advance to the next slide. Valid sources of knowledge. So how is knowledge obtained? Nyāya tells us through 4 sources: Pratyaksha, which is direct perception through our senses, Pratyaksha, and then Anumana, through inference. And the inference is there is smoke coming somewhere in the farther distance, somewhere in the forest, there must be fire there. So this is a very basic example of inference. And then we see Upamana, which is analogy or comparison. And then we see Shabda. These are the 4 sources of knowledge that Nyāya uses. Shabda is verbal or Apta Pramana, Shabda Pramana, all these are Pramanas. Shabda Pramana or Apta Pramana. Authority or Shabda. Authority is just not enough. It has to be logically deduced using a Pratyaksha, Anumana, Upamana. So that is what Nyāya says. And Nyāya deals about, let us see how Nyāya deals with doubt. You know, when there is a, when you are debating, next slide please, when we are talking about a certain, let us say, hypothesis, how do you handle that hypothesis. Nyāya kind of breaks down the process in dealing with doubt. The nature of doubt itself, how does doubt arise in human mind? Occurrence of doubt, errors in judgment. When doubt happens and we try to clarify that doubt using pramanas, using evidence, then how does errors occur in that process? And then the methodology, when we arrive at certain conclusion, how do you debate? How do you engage in scholarly debate? How do you move on with it? What are the pitfalls in those debates that you should be watching out for? Next slide, please. So let us see very quickly the nature of doubt here in the next slide. Doubt arises when mind, that is the cognizer, the one who is thinking, cognizer, the mind finds itself in a state of indecision, vacillating between different positions, right? We talked about manas, buddhi, hankara, and chittam. So when mind oscillates between which one to pick, what is the right source of evidence or right evidence for this particular topic under discussion, what are the different? So Nyāya lists 5 sources of doubt. In the next slide, you see the 5 reasons why doubt arises in the mind. So sources of doubt: pratyaksha bheda, vakya bheda, sadrishya, sandhigdha prayoga, avyakta lakshana. So these are all Sanskrit terms, very complicated for us, which is probably one of the reasons why it came out of mainstream philosophies, because of the complicated Sanskrit terminology. It is even more complicated than classical Sanskrit. Conflict of perception, you see conflict of perception. So what doubt arises when 2 or more perceptions conflict. You see something, but somebody else sees it differently. Or contradictory testimony. Doubt arises when different sources or statements about the subject provide conflicting information. And doubt also arises when 2 objects have similar characteristics and becomes challenging to distinguish between those 2. And the doubt also arises when there is lack of clarity in regard to the context in which sometimes something may appear right, but in a different context, it is not appropriate. So doubt can arise in those circumstances. And ultimately, in the partial observation, sometimes you only observe only a part of the whole phenomena and come to conclusion. So that is partial observation. That in those situations also one can arrive at doubt can arise. So in next is in the next chapter topic or the next slide, we see errors in judgment. Nyāya recognizes that human cognition is fallible. In other words, is not infallible. It is subjected to errors or mistakes in reason and perception. So there is always room for improvement, improvisation. Nyāya recognizes that. See, we think this is a small thing, but this is a huge thing when we do experiments. When an experimenter or a certain does an experiment, he brings his own biases, he brings his own conditioning into forming conclusions. So it is important to consider who is doing the experiment. In other words, when in medicine, when the field that I practice in, when we look at a scientific experiment, when we read a study, when we look at the conclusions of a trial or a study, then we always have to ask who funded it, who is doing this study, because depending on who is funding it, who is doing the study, the results can vary. Although it seems objective, it seems very quantitative in scientific experiments, the person who is doing the study brings his own biases and conditioning into the conclusions of the study. So you have to consider that. So reason, debate. Next, very interesting thing, next slide. What Nyāya provides is an extraordinary, valuable tool that it gives us in doing debates. In other words, when I come with a conclusion, when I say this is how things should be done, or this is a solution for a certain problem, then I have to present it in the form of a presented like what we call peer-to-peer review these days. So when I do the peer-to-peer review, then I have to, it is almost like engaging in a debate or a conversation with the author or with the scientist who provided it, right? So Nyāya says that there are three types of debates: Vada, Jalpa, and Vitanda. Vada, next slide. Vada is a healthy argument. It is with mutual respect. The goal of Vada, which is the debate, one type of debate, is to arrive at truth, regardless of who is right. The goal is to arrive at the truth. It is like a dialogue between two peers or two scientists who wants to understand nature of a certain phenomena, nature of reality, or whatever that is. Either person, or a group of people who are engaging in the dialogue, they are willing to change their position because they want to ultimately arrive at the truth. This is the right form of debate, Nyāya says. The outcome of such a debate is to increase the depth of knowledge. It is to explore new ideas, reconcile differences, and ultimately arrive at the truth. In contrast to Vada, we see two other types of debates called Jalpa. Next slide, please. Jalpa. In Jalpa, Swapaksha Sthapana Parapaksha Nirakaranam. Okay, so Swapaksha Sthapanam. The main aim of Jalpa is to win over the opponent by whatever means is necessary. See, I have a viewpoint, I have a conclusion in my study. The other person may have a different viewpoint. My goal is to shoot the other person down. So literally, to say, metaphorically, to cut down the other person's viewpoint and always win my argument. I can use clever tactics called chala to misinterpret, to twist the meaning of opponent theses, or sometimes I use inappropriate rebuttals called jati to confuse the other person, or sometimes I circumvent the position and disqualify the other person, that is called nigrahasthana. So I use various techniques to cut down or to undermine the my opponent viewpoint. That is called Jalpa. And then we see what is called Vitanda. This is the worst form of debate, says Nyāya. So Vitanda, the debate, I don't have any position at all, but I'm always disagreeing with the opponent's theses. So this is Vitanda. This is the worst form of debate. The goal is to silence the opponent. This form of debate is destructive. Sometimes we see this this is not only in sciences, we see it in humanities too. For example, in political debate, you see such Vitanda happening all the time. Jalpa and Vitanda happening. Jalpa is common, Vitanda is also common. Rarely you see Vada, the ideal form of debate in, for example, parliament or assembly or wherever. So the goal is to silence the opponent. This is a form, and trying to destruct the opponent's theses by discrediting them, by ridiculing them. So Nyāya says, be wary of that. In the next slide, you see how Nyāya evaluates or provides us a process of reasoning. Next slide, please. And the process of reasoning, Nyāya says there are 5 components of reasoning. This is very scientific. You will see how scientific it is. So Nyāya says there are 5 components called Pancha Avayava. So essentially 5 parts to it. Avayava parts, Pancha 5. Pratigna, Hetu, Udaharana, Upanaya, Nigamana. Pratigna, what is the question that you want to address? In other words, what is the hypothesis? And Hetu, what are the reasons that you have come up with? What is the reasoning? What is logical reasoning? Using the pramana, using all the evidence. What is the evidence that you are showing to us to prove your point? And then what are the examples, or is there any examples that were already put in place prior to this, or any precedents that were already put in place? Upanaya, establishing the relationship between those examples. Do they really apply to the current study? So that is also important. You may quote an example that is unrelated to the question of inquiry or the question you are addressing. So you have to establish a proper relationship between these two and ultimately give us a conclusion. So in other words, a hypothesis, methods to reason out, to prove your hypothesis, give examples, precedents to show whether those precedents support your hypothesis or doesn't support them, and ultimately arrive at conclusion. So I have given a simple example there, but we can move on. So this form of deductive reasoning is applied in everyday life, not just Nyaya is not just applied only in sciences. Like I said, it's applied in humanities too. For example, when a lawyer is so when you try to convince yourself using logic, using such process of reasoning, it is called Swardhanumana. Swardhanumana. If you're trying to convince others, it is called Parardhanumana. For example, a lawyer is arguing a case in a court. He is doing Parardhanumana when he is engaging in his own study, in his own office. He's doing Swardhanumana. So he's going through all this. He's looking at precedents. He is studying the cases. He is gathering evidence or hetu, and he is framing his own case in support of his case, right? So that is how Nyaya helps. And then moving on to the applications of Nyaya in the next slide, you see this framework of arriving the truth was applied in many sciences and humanities. Ayurveda, Jyotisha, Ardhashastra, Ganita Shastra, and so on. Vadashastra also appears in Mahabharata, Kautilya's Ardhashastra. And you can actually see, in even Vedanta too, you can see Nyaya. In fact, for Vedantins, to become a Vedanta scholar, you have to have knowledge of Nyaya Vaisheshika, that is Tarka, Mimamsa, Vyakarana. Only then you are actually eligible to study the deeper texts of Vedanta. So you see how important Nyaya becomes in Indian philosophical systems. So, and then you see how certain, I have given two examples of how Jain and Buddhist philosophers. Siddhasena Divakara in 450, belonging to 480 to 550 CE. He was a Jain philosopher. He wrote manuals based on Nyaya philosophy. Dharma Kirti, 600 to 670 CE. He was a Buddhist philosopher. So he used Nyaya philosophy and wrote a treatise or text called Nyāya Bindu. It is very important for logic and epistemology to establish the philosophical foundations of Buddhism. Buddhism started with Gautama Buddha, and numerous philosophers used Nyaya philosophers to support or refute their points of view. So we see in the next slide, ultimately we see how Nyaya helped in knowledge creation and validation, and it formed the bedrock of deriving, scrutinizing, and interpreting knowledge across various fields in Indian knowledge systems. And it provided a methodology and a terminology. Nyaya's terminology is very complicated, which is probably why it went out of fashion. It went out of use or study in many philosophical schools and was replaced by English or European philosophy, which is rather simple compared to Nyaya. That is one of the reasons. Nyaya's systematic rules for intellectual discourses, we have seen Vada, Jalpa, and Vitanda. They were instrumental in addressing and rectifying inconsistencies and shortcomings and their courses. Next slide, please. So in these few slides, in this few minutes, I tried to show how Nyaya, through rigorous reason, logic, and dialectics, it provided a framework for understanding, providing a foundation for all Indic knowledge systems. So in my upcoming book, you will see, if you get a chance, it's not published yet, but it will be coming up in a month or so by Rupa. So I've given a lot more information on Nyaya and other darshanas also. So I think I'll end my brief talk on Nyaya here. So Ojeshwiji, if you have any questions, or we can conclude here.
Indian philosophy's rediscovered ancient wisdom and modern relevance is a goldmine of knowledge, which is a book that has been written by Sir, for those that have finally realized the indispensability of Eastern philosophies. I would like to end this session by just reading out a few reviews of the book. The first one actually is from Sohail Sethji, who is a marketing author and a very renowned columnist. He says, Kurapati's book is essential reading for every Indian, as also Indophiles and students of societal evolution, for it outlines the role that India played in shaping ideas for the globe through its extensive and rich intellectual heft. I would also like to read Anand Ranganathanji's review, who is an author and scientist himself, a masterful exploration of India's profound intellectual heritage, offering deep insights into its rich philosophical knowledge systems. I think this talk and the reviews are a reason enough for everyone to grab it as soon as this particular book is published. Thank you very much, sir, for shedding light on such an important topic in such layman terms so that everyone who is our viewer can understand it. And we wish to have many such talks with you. Thank you very much. Namaste.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Ojaswiji.